Secure Synopsis 18th May 2021. We had missed this date, so I'm covering it up in this video. General Studies 1, the topic here is about geophysical phenomena, earthquakes and tsunami and all those disaster related things, and also some geographical features of water bodies and ice caps. Now let's have a look at the question in here. Is the Arabian Sea becoming cyclone friendly? Don't you think in recent years, strong cyclones have been developing in the Arabian Sea more frequently than earlier? Explain, right? So let's have a look at it. After recent cyclone Taukte, this is the third year in a row that the cyclones in Arabian Sea have menaced the west coast. Nisarga in 2020 even made landfall near Alibag in Maharashtra, while in 2019 Vayu moved parallel to the shoreline. Arabian Sea and Cyclone Taukte, which formed over the Arabian Sea a few hours ago, makes 2021 the fourth consecutive year to witness an Arabian Sea cyclone during the pre-monsoon season. This is also the third executive consecutive year when a cyclone has come so very close to the west coast of India. In 2019, Cyclone Vayu moved parallel to the west coast and made landfall on the coast of Gujarat. In 2020, Cyclone Nisarga was the first cyclone in recorded history that hit the Maharashtra coast in June. Experts said that recent frequency of cyclones was a clear sign of temperatures rising in the Arabian Sea. These low pressure systems are formed when warm, moist air rises up from the sea surface. Historically, waters off the western coast have experienced fewer storms than Bay of Bengal and typically weaker. The rapid warming of the Arabian Sea is leading to not just more cyclones but also more extreme rain events. So, due to these warm ocean conditions, it is seen that the cyclone intensifies from a weak cyclone to an extremely severe cyclone rapidly. Increasing frequency of cyclones on west coast, yes, we have seen a lot of these things over the years. So, let's have a look at what are the points given here. Tropical cyclones draw their energy from the warm waters, a reason why they form over the warm pool regions where temperatures are about 28 degrees Celsius. Sea surface temperatures over the Bay of Bengal are always 28 degrees Celsius, and therefore it used to host more cyclones than Arabian Sea, which is a degree or two cooler. Now, the scenario is changing due to the rapid warming. Sea surface temperatures in the Arabian Sea have increased rapidly during the past century, and now the temperatures are very often above the warm pool threshold. Warmer temperatures support active convection, heavy rainfall, and intense cyclones. Arabian Sea temperatures prior to cyclone formation are now 1.2 to 1.4 degrees Celsius, higher in the recent decades compared to those 4 decades ago. This has led to an increase in the frequency and intensity of cyclones in the Arabian Sea. Recent research shows that widespread extreme rainfall events above 150 mm per day that cause floods have also increased by threefold over India in response to Arabian Sea warming. Climate projections indicate that the Arabian Sea will continue warming due to increasing carbon emissions, resulting in more intense cyclones in the future. Considering that both cyclones and floods due to heavy rains are increasing across the west coast, along with a gradual rise in sea level, we need to be prepared. Let's conclude it. Global warming has presented us with new challenges such as rapid intensification of cyclones, which need to be closely monitored at higher resolution and accuracy using on site platforms such as buoys and moorings, improving the Indian Ocean observing system, and incorporating the global warming signals in the weather models can all help us tackle the challenges of intense cyclones in the future. The freedom struggle, its various stages and important contributors and contributions from different parts of the country, post-independence consolidation and reorganization within the country. Discuss in what way the policies of Jawaharlal Nehru aided in the nation building and post-independence consolidation of India. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India and control figure in Indian politics before and after independence. He emerged as the paramount leader of the Indian independence movement under the tutelage of Mahatma Gandhi and led India from its establishment as an independent nation in 1947 until his death in 1964. The Nehruvian policies that aided nation building post independence are consolidation of the nation. Nehru took a firm stance against the possible division of India into smaller principalities. He established the State Reorganization Committee to fulfill regional aspirations of the people, which would lower the chances of them wanting to cede from the nation. This way, he strengthened the unity. Rehabilitation of refugees. Refugees from Pakistan were given shelter and attempts were made to reduce communalism. Secularism. It was mainly due to Jawaharlal Nehru's efforts that India emerged as a secular state in the mid 20th century. Much before independence, he played a heroic role in the development of a secular basis for Indian polity. This helped in building the narrative of unity in diversity. Welfare state. Nehru was a practical idealist and believed that socialism and democracy were not contradictory but complementary to each other. He wanted to build a welfare state for the equitable distribution of wealth. Planning Commission. Nehru, a pragmatic socialist, understood the importance of the welfare state in a country which does not have sufficient infrastructure, established a planning commission for long term planning of social schemes. Non alignment policy. Nehru, being the foreign minister, did not want to join either of the power blocs. Also, he did not want to remain in India aloof from the world politics. Therefore, Nehru's visionary approach to establish NAM with the other third world countries proved to be an ideal foreign policy approach. The period of Nehru is recorded in the history as Nehruvian era, during which democracy took the roots and social, economic, cultural, and educational development for the nation building. Despite facing daunting tasks, he was successful in maintaining the maintaining the strength of the nation, isn't it? Now let's have a look at the next question. General Studies 2. Government policies and intervention for development in various sectors and issues arising out of their design and implementation. Sedition law has been a matter of debate for long in the country, especially with the concerns of its misuse. In the context, do you think that the law needs to be scrapped? Analyze. As per Section 124A of the IPC, sedition is an act that brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite dissatisfaction towards the government established by law in India by words, either spoken or written, or by signs or visible misrepresentation or otherwise. Right. So the section 124A of the Indian Penal Code is a pre-independence provision which covers sedition charges against government. Various verdicts by Indian judiciary have led to a reinterpretation and re-examination of sedition in light of Article 19 of the Constitution. There has been an effort to strike a balance between right to free speech and expression, power of state to impose reasonable restrictions, which comes under Article 19, Clause 2. In 1962, the Supreme Court in Kedarnath Singh versus State of Bihar upheld Section 124A and held that it struck a correct balance between fundamental rights and the need for public order. The court had significantly reduced the scope of sedition law to only those cases where there is incitement to imminent violence towards overthrow of the state. Further, the court held that it is not mere against the government of the day but the institutions as symbol of state. Should sedition be scrapped against democratic norms, it stifles the democratic and fundamental right of people to criticize the government. Inadequate capacity of state machinery, the police might not have the requisite training to understand the consequences of imposing such a stringent provision. Possibility of misuse, it has been used arbitrarily to curb dissent. In many cases, the main targets right? So the main targets have been writers, journalists, activists who question the government policies, projects, political dissenters. The draconian nature of this law, as the crime is non-bailable, non-cognizable, and punishment can extend for life, it has a strong deterrence effect on dissent even if it is not used. Used to gag press, the press should be protected so that it could bear the secrets of governments and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. Arguments in favor of Section 124A, not really a draconian law. Now, after the Supreme Court directions, its jurisdiction has been narrowed down. It can be applied only on grounds laid down by the court. Application is a part of reasonable restrictions. It is provided under the Article 19, Clause 2. Does not really curb free speech. One can use any kind of strong language in criticism of the government without inviting sedition. However, such dissent should not be turned into some kind of persuasion to break the country. Threats to unity and integrity of nation due to the presence of anti-national elements and divisive forces such as Naxal separatists who are receiving support from inside and outside the country. Mere misuse cannot be a ground of repeal, rather, provision should be made where such misuse is eliminated. The guidelines of the SC must be incorporated in Section 124A as well by amendment to IPC so that any ambiguity must be removed. Only those actions, words that directly result in the use of violence or incitement to violence should be termed seditious. The state police so the guidelines of the Supreme Court must be incorporated in Section 124A as well by amendment to IPC so that any ambiguity must be removed. Only those actions, words that directly result in the use of violence or incitement to violence should be termed seditious. The state police must be sufficiently guided as to where the section must be imposed and where it must not. Need to include provisions where the government can be penalized if it misuses the section. This will ensure that Section 124A of the IPC strikes a balance between security and smooth functioning of state with the fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression. The next topic is issues relating to development and management of social sector services like health, education, human resources. What kind of practices need to be adopted to develop a robust pandemic response? Examine the pandemic preparedness and discuss both short term and long term measures. The scale of the coronavirus pandemic could have been prevented. An independent global panel has said a toxic cocktail of waiting and poor coordination must cost many people their lives. The second wave is ravaging lives in India. Variants, let's have a look at variants. The combination of a large asymptomatic population and the presence of more infectious variants like B1.617 of the virus during the second wave, which is much steeper than the first wave. For instance, the UK strain detected in a significant proportion during genome surveillance in India and Punjab has shown a 50% higher transmission, according to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The L4F52R mutation found in the variant B1.671, first detected in India, too has been associated with increased infectivity. Containment zone, second, in the second current wave, the marking of a containment zone has been less strict. In cities, the government has asked civil authorities to adopt micro containment with perhaps just a floor or a house defined as a containment zone. Healthcare infrastructure shortage of beds, oxygen, remdesivir became steeper with patients dying due to crumbling healthcare infrastructure, black marketing, hoarding, and profiteering became bane to the poor. Protocol fatigue, when cases started declining, people just broke out of the protocol of wearing a face mask, washing hands regularly, and maintaining social physical distance. Gathering began becoming large, particularly during the January 2021 onwards. Rules were relaxed, penalties were not enforced. The pattern was seen across the country, allowing the novel coronavirus to create a second and possibly stronger wave. Mixed signal from government. The queues outside polling booths and gathering at the election rallies of all the parties defeat COVID 19 protocol. This sent a confusing message to the public and also the grassroots level functionaries of the government. It weakened the vigil against the pandemic. Urban mobility. India has recorded over 1.2 crore cases of COVID 19, yet the pandemic is still mostly concentrated around cities, especially the bigger cities. The cities have greater mobility, giving more opportunities for the virus to spread from one person to another, given the guard is lower. Short term and long term measures needed. There are only two ways of getting immunity from the virus. One is getting infected, and the other is via a vaccine. Therefore, it is important to fast track the vaccine program across the country, but testing is equally important. The number of tests must go up again, and contact tracing, ideally 20% for every case, should be taken up intently. Decentralize the response to district level. Knowledge of existing and evolving local conditions matters for the design and delivery of an effective response. Local data gathering and analysis provide real time intelligence for rapid response. Local community networks are important channels for information dissemination and for partnering the administration and implementation. We need consultative policy making at the national level, interdepartmental planning at the state level, data driven decentralized decision making for situation adaptive implementation at the district level. The district collector must coordinate healthcare services across all facilities in the district and be empowered to commander hospitals, hotels, and transport facilities as needed. Prevent super spreader events and mandate masks. Testing numbers are again being projected as the best measure of an efficient and effective response. This is incorrect. While tests are indeed an important component of the strategy, we cannot test asymptomatically infected persons and mildly symptomatic persons who do not report themselves. These constitute a very large number at any time, as we know from antibody surveys. We cannot randomly and repeatedly test large proportions of the population to detect virus presence in such potentially infective persons. Masks, if worn well and regularly in public and even in outdoor gatherings, will greatly reduce the risk of transmission from any infected person known or unknown. Even the more infectious variant will be blocked by effective masks, even where physical distancing is not possible. Conclusion: nonetheless, as India aims to inoculate more and more people, it is imperative to ramp up vaccine production. It is important for the government, therefore, to come up with rational activity curbs, keep them stable, and incentivize people, including through financial rewards. These incentives can lower the perception of lost opportunities and compensate workers in the affected sectors such as travel, food, and hospitality industries. This roadmap can be reviewed when vaccines become widely available and cases decline, although a return to a carefree past is a long way off. Political communication on the state of the pandemic lacked a clear sense of purpose during festivals and poll campaigns. Now, the COVID 19 strategy can avoid costly partial or full lockdowns only with the public cooperation, and that calls for building credibility and trust. Let's move on to the next topic, General Studies 3. Major crops and cropping patterns is the topic here, and also some e-technologies in the aid of farmers. Let's have this look at the question: why farmers today need to take up precision farming? Discuss the associated prospects in bringing modern agricultural revolution. Precision farming is an approach where inputs are utilized in precise amounts to get increased average yields compared to traditional cultivation techniques. An information and technology based farm management system identifies, analyzes, and manages variability in fields by conducting crop production practices at the right place and time and in the right way for optimum profitability, sustainability, and protection of the land resource. What is the need for precision farming and associated aspects in bringing modern agri-revolution? Precision farming enables climate-smart agribusiness. Precision agriculture enables climate-smart farming with right amount of inputs while ensuring the land remains fertile. Drip irrigation, in addition to its advantages over other types of irrigation for improving yields, drip irrigation is the best delivery system for soluble fertilizers. It also drastically reduces the propagation of weeds and need for herbicides. Soil and crop monitoring, early detection and correction of soil and crop deficiencies is a win-win proposition for both farmers and off-takers. It helps in pest management and remove weeds detrimental to crops. Forecasting, advanced models of forecasting is needed using supercomputers such as Pratyush and Mihir so that farmers can sow seeds at the right time and harvest at the right time. So technologies include a vast array of tools of hardware, software and equipment such as global positioning system, receivers, differential global positioning system, geographic information systems, remote sensing, variable rate applicator, and combine harvesters with yield monitors. Significant of precision farming to increase agriculture productivity, prevent soil degradation, reduction of chemical application in crop production, efficient use of water resources, dissemination of modern farm practices to improve quality, quantity, and reduced cost of production, developing favorable attitudes, precision farming, changing the socio-economic status of farmers. Challenges: high cost in India. One major problem is the small field size. More than 58% of operational holdings in the country have less than 1 hectare, and majority are small farmers who do subsistence farming. Lack of technical expertise, knowledge, and technology. Traditional approaches are used by farmers who are not technology oriented, not applicable or difficult or costly for small holdings. It is uneconomical in case of small holdings. Heterogeneity of cropping systems and market imperfections are detrimental to precision farming. Way forward: policy approach to promote precision farming at farm level. Identify the niche areas for the promotion of crop specific precision farming. Creation of multidisciplinary teams involving agricultural scientists in various fields, engineers, manufacturers, and economists to study the overall scope of precision agriculture. Provide complete technical backup support to the farmers to develop pilots or models which can be replicated on a large scale. Pilot studies should be conducted on farmers' fields to show the results of precision agriculture implementation. Creating awareness among farmers about consequences of applying imbalanced doses of farm inputs like irrigation, fertilizers, insecticides, and pesticides. General studies 4. Topic: ethics and human interface, essence and determinants and consequences of ethics in human actions. Dimensions of ethics, ethics in private and public relationships, and all of these things. Let's have a look at the question and answer to this. What is the difference between economic value and social value? Do you think social values are more important than economic values? Examine with suitable justification. Social value is created when resources, inputs, processes, or policies are combined to generate improvements in the lives of livelihoods or society as a whole. Economic value, on the other hand, can be described as a measure of the benefit from a good or a service to an economic agent. It is typically measured in units of currency. Social value, it is in this arena that most non-profits justify their existence, and unfortunately, it is at this level that one has the most difficulty measuring the true value created. Examples of social value creation may include such products as cultural arts performances, the pleasure of enjoying a hike in the woods, or the benefit of living in a more just society. Social value is about inclusion and access. Social value can be found in anti racism efforts, some aspects of community organizing, animal rights advocacy, and folk art. It has intrinsic value but can be difficult to agree upon or quantify. Economic value: an entity creates economic value by making use of resources, inputs, or processes, increasing the value of these inputs, and then by generating cost savings for the public system or environment of which the entity is a part. An example of the practical application of economic value is the weighing of the merits of college degrees in different disciplines. There is a consensus that a college degree has more economic value than a high school diploma, and that some college degrees have a higher economic value than others. Social value versus economic values. There can be no inclusive growth if the nation is lacking in social values like gender equality, non discrimination, brotherhood, sisterhood, cooperation, respect of rights of all, etc. For any nation, imbibing social values must precede economic values and to unleash the potential of masses and hence achieve the inclusive growth. They say that it is morals and etiquettes that make us civilized and not merely development in terms of economic structures. Human beings transformed not magically from an ape like early man to what we are today. It was only when we started learning social values that brought the slow and steady change. On the other side, I would say that without economic values, nations would remain underdeveloped and cursed like the third world countries. Under the tormenting lack of economic values, people lose their minds and also all social values are forgotten. That's why people do not think twice before committing a crime when they're allured with monetary gain. So there can be no peace without social values, and hence they are more important than economic values. What makes India far better as a nation than Bangladesh or Pakistan is our social values. The way we appreciate our diversity and live together despite having frequent clashes. Whatever might say about the existence of intolerance in India, the fact remains that we will still continue to peacefully coexist at large. Right. So the next topic is about ethics in public administration. So as a civil servant, ethics is more about understanding the right thing to do and and the rights that you have to do. Right. Explain it that it's simplest. Ethics is a system of moral principles. They affect how we make decisions and lead our lives. Moral integrity is the bedrock of civil service. Civil servants are like steel pillars and help give strength to policy framework and its implementation. They are also the torch bearers of major transformations. In short, there is a need to push for virtuousness in budding public officials. What's the importance of understanding ethics by civil servants? Civil servants are the true executioners of welfare policy of the government. For this, they must not only understand procedurally the right thing to do, although people in public service generally work to improve the lives of the public. Their behavior in public service is based on subjective morals and belief systems as opposed to universal ethical principles. The purpose of ethics is to bridge the gap between these varying moral systems, ensuring that public service represents all of the public. Importantly, trust in public service is forever being eroded by public officials and organizations acting unethically. This may take the form of an organization serving different populations inequitably, or it may be a more overt betrayal, such as an elected official misusing public money. Even if they are not they are elected, public servants must be held accountable to the public. When public servants violate the public trust, they violate the public sense of representation, undermining the very institutions that undergird our democracy. Thus, unethical behavior is antithetical to public service and the principles of democracy. As a civil servant, one must uphold and conduct oneself in the following manner: advance the public interest, uphold the constitution and the law, promote democratic participation, strengthen social equity, fully inform and advise, demonstrate personal integrity, promote ethical organizations, advance professional excellence. Ethics is an essential part of the public service work and maintaining the integrity of democratic institutions. As public administrators, one plays a crucial role in instilling trust and responsibility in the public sector through ethical behavior and conduct. Right? As civil servants must do the right thing regardless of whether there are possible consequences. One must treat other people well and behave morally, not because they are afraid of the possible consequences. Simply put, people do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. More so with civil servants as they hold the baton of welfare of the larger society. Recently, we saw a district collector is bashing up a person and throwing his mobile phone down and giving a slap to him. So this kind of behavior is not good for the civil service, because civil servants are the steel pillars of the country and they should have compassion, they should have empathy, they should treat the other citizen as their own brother or sister, and that is when the society can move forward. And they should not worry about the consequences that on which they take actions. So if it is benefiting the people, they'll have to go ahead and take those actions and not be worried about what the politician is going to say, because the politician is going to be there only for 5 years, but you have a massive amount of service left with you for about close to 30 years from the date you join to the civil services, right? So being a civil servant is one of the most important, one of the most proud thing that anybody can have in this country. And if he has got a chance to serve this country as a civil servant, he has to have that compassion, and only then his life is well lived. Thank you so much for being part of this video. It was a fantastic last question, and I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you so much. Please like this video and also subscribe to my channel, and also press the bell icon so that you keep getting these notifications whenever I make such videos and help you all every time, every day. Thank you so much.